This week on Take Back the Advantage, deceptive Soviet wheat market manipulation, deception through truth, and an interview with PacketViper CTO Don Gray. You ever set your alarm in the morning for an early call only to have that call canceled after you've already gotten up? If you want to avoid that situation forevermore, click subscribe. Let's go. Deception has been around for a long time. One interesting example of deception happened in the early 70s, actually 1971. In 1971, the former Soviet Union was facing a wheat crop shortage, right? They were having some issues, I'm not really sure why, but they were significantly short in their wheat crop. And let's face it, they got a lot of people to feed in the Soviet Union. So what was going to have to happen is they were going to have to go buy wheat on the open market. Now, if it became aware, or if the world at large became aware that this wheat crop shortage was actually happening, then what that would do is inflate the cost of wheat on the open market. So the Soviet Union would end up having to spend an incredibly large amount of money. They didn't want to do that. So what they actually did was they engaged in a deception campaign that allowed them to not only get the wheat, right? They were able to get the wheat at fairly low prices. They were even able to get the US government to subsidize the purchase of that wheat. So again, early 1971, they have the wheat crop shortage. They engage in that deception campaign. And so what they ended up doing after a little while was they started contacting through kind of aliases and all that kind of stuff. They contracted major U.S. wheat exporters, and they were able to purchase 440 million bushels of wheat from the United States. So they purchased that, and I believe that cost them something like $700 million. But they also negotiated a trade deal with the U.S., including $750 million in credit for purchasing grain over the next 3 years. So they got the grain at a low rate, and they were able to even get U.S. taxpayers to subsidize some of that purchase, which was kind of an interesting thing. So how did they do it? Well, at this point in time, the U.S. had representative attaches from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the Soviet Union. And these attaches were responsible for estimating crop production in the Soviet Union. Now, at the time, again, we're talking about early 70s, the only way they could do that is visual estimation. So what happened was the Soviets basically only took them to high producing fields, and they made sure that they didn't bring them anywhere near any of the poorly producing fields. Now, the U.S. attaches, they actually did suspect that they were being fooled, but they had no way to prove it whatsoever. So the Soviets got their wheat at a discount, and they got a credit from the U.S. government. And because all this wheat was bought up, the rest of the world actually ended up having to endure those higher wheat prices. Now, what in the world does this have to do with cyber? Well, in the example of the wheat, what the Soviets did was they distracted the U.S. government attaches. They basically showed them what they wanted them to see, not what they didn't want them to see. And that is a fantastic thing in the world of cyber, because let's face it, we have production systems that contain things that we don't want our adversaries to get their hands on. So what can we do? Well, we can guide them using deceptive tactics to non-production or notional systems. Now, part of this whole process for the Soviets was they actually showed real fields, right? This was actually showing actual production wheat fields. And this was a verifiable truth. And that's one of the things about deception. A lot of times people think that deception is all about lying. And there's a lot of lying involved in deception. But at the same point in time, it is also very valuable to present your adversary with a verifiable truth, because that verifiable truth can reinforce the lies, basically, the messages and all that kind of fun stuff. So kind of an interesting story out of history. I always like to throw a quote in there. This quote, I've done quotes from Sun Tzu 2,000 years ago plus. This one is not nearly as far as that. This one's actually from a 2006 article on the Handbook of Information Security, and it's from a gentleman by the name of Fred Cohen. And Fred, basically what he said is, unlike people, computers don't typically have egos, but they do have built-in expectations, and in some cases automatically seek to obtain goals. If those expectations and goals can be met or encouraged while carrying out the deception, the computers will fall prey just as people do. And it's kind of an interesting concept because I often talk about the target of deception being the human being on the other side of the keyboard, that the person that is the attacker. And I fully believe that. But at the same point in time, that attacker is going to view our environments via the use of tools. They're going to be using attacker tools and information collection tools. And if we know what those tools are, and we can effectively get those tools to lie to the attacker, that facilitates our goals there as well, which is pretty cool. So that brings us up to our interview today. So today we are going to be interviewing, or we're going to have a conversation with Don Gray. So Don is the Chief Technology Officer for PacketViper. He's also, got a history. He's a founder and chief technology officer of managed security service provider Vigilant Minds in the past. He worked as the security strategist for NTT Security, frequent speaker at various industry events, Gartner Security Summits, Forrester, RSA, all that kind of fun stuff. He has a BS in Business Administration and Computer Science from California University of PA, where he also serves as an industry advisor for the College of Science and Technology. So Don, welcome to Take Back the Advantage, and anything you want to add to that? Anything I missed?
No, I thank you very much, first of all. But I don't think you missed anything. I think it's interesting when I look at, as you talked about, the attacker looking at the world through tools, right? Is we all do that. We all need tools to assist us to be able to understand what we're looking at. And we look at the process of what attackers go through to be able to, select targets and then, try to exploit those targets. I think of it, so I have, as you mentioned, a business degree with a minor in computer science. I sort of veered off that onto computer science, but also run a business as well. So I'm pretty familiar with lots of different aspects of running a business. One of those is sales, right? And when you talk to a salesperson, they talk about their funnel, right? Their funnel of opportunities. And so the idea is that you want to get as many people as possible into the top of the funnel. You want as many prospects as possible. You want as many leads as possible. And then as you go through the funnel, you're narrowing the funnel down. You're going through the opportunities. You're qualifying the leads. You're understanding what they have. You're figuring out if you're a fit for them, if you can go forward, and you can ultimately, as a salesperson, exploit them and extract cash, right? Mm-hmm. Attackers go through exactly the same kind of process. And so when I think about what attackers do and the tools they use during that process, especially at the top of that funnel, right, automation plays a key part, and technology assistance plays a key part, because you're still trying to pick out, the likely target that you'll be able to get the most from a field of opportunities.
And I think that's a super, super important point, because a lot of people who don't really understand the world of information security kind of have this belief, maybe it's implicit, maybe it's explicit, but it's this belief that attackers pick a target. I'm going to attack XYZ company, and then they just put forth all of their effort into attacking XYZ company. And that absolutely does happen, sure, right? It does. But it's not the only way that organizations get target. I kind of look at it as a targeted attack versus a target of opportunity attack. Absolutely. A lot of bad guys just are like, heck, I don't care who or what I compromise. There's value everywhere. And so I'm going to scan the planet. I'm going to look for the low-hanging fruit. And let's face it, it's a big planet with a lot of low-hanging fruit. Yeah. And they just bump into, hey, I just happened to find this vulnerability. And this aspect, if you think about it from that perspective and kind of put your sort of sales funnel analogy, if my organization presents a harder target, I don't mean hard necessarily as in fortified, but hard as in difficult. A simple example, if I go and I port scan your public facing IP addresses and all 65,535 usable ports happen to be open, I just might not want to bother with trying to mess around with that. I'll go to an easier target. And so the things that we do, whether it's traditional security controls or deception, those things that make our environments more difficult, more challenging, more confusing, that can increase the amount of uncertainty on the part of the attacker, can play a really good role in terms of just strict deterrence or just causing them additional cycles as well. Now, that's not the only reason we would use deception, but I think that's a really valuable point.
Oh no, we talk about that all the time, especially, people talk about, botnet wranglers or people that rent a botnet to be able to, do an attack campaign. If I can exhaust their resources, right? If I can force them to have to move, force them to have to switch, attack points or vectors into my organization, like you said, eventually they're going to be like, okay, this is wasting my time. I'm going to go to the target of opportunity. The car that has the doors unlocked, I'm going to go in that one. Right.
Yeah. And I think this also points out a really, really important, and I would say if there is one consistent trend that pretty much everybody that I've talked to about deception agrees upon, it is we as deception planners need to understand our adversary. We need to know what they are doing, what they're trying to do, what their expectations are, the approaches, because the more we know about the adversary, the more we can manipulate their behavior in whatever way that you want. What would you say, for those people who are they're like, all right, I've watched a couple of these videos, I kind of want to do this deception thing. What would you say to somebody who says, what are my first steps? What should I do? I've just decided to get involved in this deception stuff. Now, of course, I know the answer is call PacketViper.
Well,
right?
yeah,
That's okay. But from a general perspective, what do people need to be ready for? What should they do today?
I think that one of the biggest things, and I think you've talked about this before, is what are you trying to get out of using deception, right? What's your goal? Because different deception technologies have different strengths and approaches. And so I think that's the first thing, is to figure out what's your goal. Is your goal to be able to collect, and harvest IOC that you can then use in other defenses within your organization? Is it your goal to study and try to perhaps add, be able to do some attribution to who's targeting your organization, so you can feed that up into the business as business intelligence that might figure out, from a geo political competitive standpoint, where you fit into the world and who may be looking at you? Or, is your goal perhaps more practical and simple in that you just want to stop people from being able to attack your organization as much as they can, right? So I think that's probably the first thing, is to figure out what's the goal in doing it, and then that will help tailor what approach you would take or what tools you might use to decide, what you're going to do.
So you bring up a good point. I really like the concept of goals. And you also mentioned that, let's face it, there are a lot of different deception technology solutions that are out there. And and there's a case to be made that you could kind of build your own stuff internally, so there are a lot of options out there. Now, I'll put the big caveat out there, is I always like to tell people nothing is free, right?
Right.
You want to build something using your own stuff. You want to go use open source things. You're going to be spending a lot of time building that all up. Whereas if you go buy a commercial solution, you might spend a little bit more money from a capital expense perspective, but nothing's free. Now, to the point of there are a bunch of different solutions out there, and everybody's got their own take on it. One of the things that I've noticed is that in the deception space, most of the deception vendors that I've talked to, basically they spend most of their time trying to convince people that deception equals good, right? It's a fight the battle of deception, as opposed to here's why my solution is better than their solution.
Right.
So I'll say, do you see that from your organization? And the second part of the question is, what do we need to do to fix that?
So I tend to focus on outcomes, right? What outcome do you want from deception, right? Which plays back into what are your goals and all that stuff. I've talked to CISOs at very large, well-funded organizations who are, have had a deception project on the roadmap for some time, right? And haven't pulled the trigger on it. And part of what I see from that is a perception, right? We got to get our words straight here. Yeah. Deception, perception is a perception that they're unclear about the value they'll actually receive from deception, right? What will it really do for me? Will I be able to take advantage from any information that I do learn? Let's say I buy the best deception technology out there, I implement it, and I'm able to gather information about who's trying to attack me and find out all kinds of details about what tools they're using and all that other stuff. If I can't do anything with it, it doesn't really matter, right? And so I think that's one of the big things I hear. I think that the second probably biggest one I hear is, I'm concerned that it's going to cause confusion in my environment. I have a complicated enough environment without putting a bunch of fake stuff out there that looks like it's doing things and certain things. I'm concerned that it's going to make life more difficult, not less difficult. So I hear those kinds of feedbacks about why people don't move forward.
Yeah. And to me, it almost sounds like it, and I think that there's a lot to unpack in those two very simple statements, right? So when people are like, well, what's deception going to do for me? That's not even a question. It's kind of weird, but that's not a question that actually can be answered on the surface, right? What is deception going to do for me? I don't have any idea. Like, how are you going to use it? What are you going to do with it? And I think that ends up being one of those big challenges. And kind of going back to this conversation of, you talk about goals and objectives, and we talked about this briefly before we jumped on this, before we started recording. Most people have become familiar with equating technology to goal, right? The technology is part and parcel to the goal, right? I buy a firewall because I want to block traffic. I want to control traffic on my network. I buy an IDS because, I know what the goal is just because I bought the technology. This is a pen. I know what a pen is used for. With deception technology, though, the goal isn't inherent in the technology, right? You could have somebody that wants deception technology purely to detect bad guys as quickly as possible. You could have somebody who wants to facilitate the collection of threat intelligence. You could have somebody who wants to do attribution. You could have somebody that wants to actually have human beings interact directly with the attackers in real time.
Sure. All
of these are potential goals, and they're very different from each other. And you can do any of them. You can do some of them, none of them, all of them, whatever. So I think that's kind of a really important thing, is that we've got to start talking about deception as, a deception is a method. It's not a it's not a technology, it's a method. We just implement it via a bunch of technologies. So I think that's a really, really important piece of that puzzle. And then talking about what value are you going to get out of it? I don't know. What are your goals? It really ends up being that kind of thing. Do you think one of the things that I tend to see is that, and it's kind of a good news, bad news thing. I see a lot of people scared of, maybe scared is an overstatement, but I see a lot of people sort of scared about deception. We're not ready. We gotta do 100 different things before we're ready to go implement deception. And I'll be honest, most of the vendors that I've talked with are like, no, just go do it. Right? This is the thing about deception that I've seen is there might be some complexities in terms of a specific vendor deployment, but the technology isn't generally all that complicated. Let's face it, at its core, we're talking about technology that evolved from honeypots, which have been around for decades. And we're talking about concepts that have been around for 2,000 plus years. And I think that people get all worried, like, oh my gosh, what if we don't do it right? So what would you say to an organization? Like, if I'm the I don't know, the chief security officer of an organization, I'm considering deception. What's the advice to get over the perceived, I'm worried about this and I'm worried about that?
Well, I guess, somebody told me a long time ago, if you turn over the rock, you're going to find wiggly things underneath, right? And deception is an additional tool that will identify wiggly things on your network that you may or may not want to see, or you may or may not be prepared for. But so I would say bottom line is that any deception technology, including ours, is going to help you identify things that you may not have known were occurring or how they were occurring on your network. And that's always a good thing, right? More knowledge is power, and having more knowledge is better. Avoiding surprises is always a good thing. But I do have to say that I think it's not that all the things you have to do to be ready for it, but there is this idea of, am I going to implement it and then sort of fall off a cliff, right? I can implement it, all the tools, make it real easy to implement, lots of decoys and things on the network. And that's great. But then what do you do with the information you get out of it, right? You are going to get information about people trying to attack you, but you have to do something with it, right? To actually get the value from the investment. And that is the hard part with most deception technologies, is that you need people who can do some level of threat analysis, that have some sophistication about, what they're looking at. And so, that I can understand that is a concern, that you don't want to make that investment, make the effort, and then sort of like when IDS first came out, right? Everybody installed an IDS and it was like freaking out because all it did was spew out all these alerts, right? And then they sort of like turned the squelch knob down and down and down until it didn't give them as many alerts because they couldn't do anything with the alerts that it was giving them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think there is that same issue. I don't think that's, sort of made up or people are wrong in thinking that. They do have to consider, what are they going to do with the information?
Yeah. I did a video, a little short, I think it was like a 15-minute video where I talked about the cyber deception top 4. And it was basically the 4 things that I believe you need to do or be ready for in order to deploy cyber deception. One of those is know thyself, right? You've got to know what your own environment looks like, asset inventory, data classification, all that kind of fun stuff. We should be doing that anyways. Like, that shouldn't be rocket science, but you should know what's on your network and kind of what it looks like. The second thing is know thy enemy, right? We should know something about the bad guys and what their behavior is, and whether that's taking a look at things like MITRE's attack matrix or some of the other models that are out there, or hiring or doing or whatever penetration tests or whatever, but you need to know something about the adversary. The third one was know thy goals. What are you trying to accomplish with this? And then the fourth one was incident response, right? It was, when you put this in, we're talking about effectively a high fidelity, low noise detection solution, at least in part. And when it goes off, you had better be ready to do something about it.
Right.
Because otherwise you've just wasted, not only have you wasted tremendous resources, but you potentially even put yourself into a liability position where that there's an attack going on and you haven't done anything about it. So there are some concerns there. But in all honesty, if you kind of know what your environment looks like, if you know know something about the adversary, if you have specific, clearly defined goals for deception, and you have the capability of responding to those, I think that any organization should be able to do that without too much difficulty.
Yeah, the response is a tough one. I ran the incident response group at NTT Security for a while, and in all the surveys we did and our discussions with customers and everything, it was roughly half of the organizations we talked to didn't really have a credible incident response plan, right? They either had a plan, but it was so outdated and so, it needed updated and needed refreshed. They didn't have regular, any kind of like even, annual exercise of the incident response plan, those kinds of things. So it is hard. It's not easy to do. And, you have to have a commitment to doing it and support from upper management to be able to get that stuff done.
Oh yeah. And I mean, let's face it, I've gone the number of times that I've done security work for, let's say, a hospital, and their incident response plan is explicitly what is required for HIPAA compliance, right? It's notification of entities that need to be notified.
Contact PR firm.
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is kind of interesting is, to some extent, I think that deception makes incident response maybe harder. And I don't necessarily mean it in a significant way, but the options when you deploy deceptions on incident response, most organizations, if they did normal non-deceptive environments, they detect a bad guy on their network, they kick the bad guy off, right? It's the swat the mosquito approach. But if you have a deceptive environment, that might not be the right way to do it. It could be. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying you got to analyze the situation. But once I detect the bad guy on my network, I have actionable attack-specific threat intelligence, right? I know the IP address that this guy's coming from. I know where they are, so maybe I watch them. And as long as they don't start interacting with my crown jewels, my secret sauce, whatever, I can just keep an eye on them. I may not even be concerned about collecting threat intelligence, more of a keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I know where this guy is. That's a known quantity. If I kick them off, they fire up another DigitalOcean droplet. They come in from a different IP address and they change their tactics. And so I think that in some cases, incident response maybe gets a little bit more complicated. Not necessarily complicated, but it opens up so many additional options in deceptive environments. And so part of the thing that I'm doing in the class that I'm writing is actually having an entire section on incident response in deceptive environments, because it really needs to be there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept. I think I would have to, if I was on the other side of the table, right, I'd have to understand how I was going to educate my organization into this concept of potentially, playing with our food before we eat it, right?
Yeah.
Because sitting up on a court, testimony witness stand saying, "Oh, you knew the attacker was there for 3 months before you did anything." Like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And I will say, it kind of, all of it is, it depends, right? And that's where this aspect of, I was talking to one guy, Chris Roberts, and he was like, "Nope, you break into my house, I'm shooting you. That's it. That's all there is to it, right? Done. Have a nice day." And his response to this, watch the attacker, is that's the world of academics. That's what academics want to do. I just want to deal with the threat. And I can't argue with that. But I will say that, to me, one of the big challenges we have in defensive security is that we place technology in the way of human beings. So almost all of our security controls is just sort of some static technology. And I say static as in it's not a human. It can't think and reason. It just sits there and does whatever it was programmed to do. And then a human comes up against it. Well, the human wins that battle eventually all the time. And so by having more of an active engagement, we potentially get to the role where we have a human being up against another human being. Now, not every organization is going to be ready for that. I'm not even sure that the security industry as a whole is ready for that right now, but I can see that as an ultimate direction. And when we get there, we completely change the game of attacker versus defender, which I think is super powerful.
Or AI versus AI. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about PacketViper in particular. A lot of different deception technologies out there. What separates you guys from the pack? What's the difference that you guys bring to bear?
There's two big things. We fully support and have a lot of customers using deception on their internet perimeter.
Okay.
And we are typically deployed inline.
Okay.
And so we can affect change immediately. based on what we see happening on the network.
Okay, so this is probably going to be a really bad analogy,
Okay.
but if most deception vendors are an IDS, you're an IPS.
That is not a bad analogy. And in fact, we talk about that, right? That IDSs morphed into IPSs because to receive value, right, to get the perceived value from the solution, most customers said it needs to stop some things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't turn on my whole signature base for blocking. Maybe it's only the real critical, stuff. And maybe I put some guardrails around not shutting my e-commerce site down during Christmas and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to really get a, the measure of value from it, it has to stop stuff from happening.
So, and I think to that point, if you think about the number of attacks that are automated, so they happen really fast, and I don't even remember where I read it, but I distinctly remember reading some report talking about the number of actions involved in an attack.
Right.
And, if I'm not really into this world of computer hacking and security and all that, I almost have this perception that it is a long process of compromising an environment. Whereas this report, and I don't have the metrics or whatever, but like a 10-step attack is massively large. A lot of these attacks are 1, 2, 3 steps.
Yes, sir.
And so if you are trying to stop any kind of breach, if you want to stop the bad guys from getting on your boxes before they get access to anything sensitive, and you're trying to do that within like 3 detectable steps, which is really difficult to do. But having some way of automating a response to say, well, if we get to a level of this level of suspicious, we're going to apply a control to that. I think that helps out a tremendous amount. I think that's a very cool thing.
Part of what I did at NTT was run our threat intelligence team, right? So global threat intelligence team, great set of people, excellent resources available at our fingertips. NTT is one of the largest providers in the world. And what I would tell people, we give them actionable intelligence, right? We give them intelligence that they can do something with, which is awesome. However, they still have to go through that step of doing something with it, right? Yep. And so at PacketViper, what I talk about is applied intelligence, right? It's not intelligence you could do something with. It's intelligence that we already did do something with on your behalf. And, we talked about IDSs and that sort of squelch knob, right? And I go back to when people first started installing IDSs and putting, snort in place and commercial IDSs and all that, it created more work for them. And the real thing I really like about our approach is it does work on a customer's behalf. It can cause them less work,
right?
Which is a good thing.
Oh, it's a beautiful thing. And I mean, it's kind of funny because the whole concept of IDS and IPS and SIM, so we come up with IDS and it didn't work. It didn't work because I always tell people, particularly network-based IDS is a fundamentally flawed technology. I don't mean it's a bad technology. I mean, it's fundamentally flawed because it lacks context. So it's just a lot of alerts that I don't really know what they mean. So we kind of morphed. We tried doing SIM, where we're going to try to add context to it, and or we try to go more of a proactive blocking. And I've done some research recently, and I was surprised at the statistics that I found. And I really wasn't shocked. It was just, I didn't realize the problem was as bad as it is. The best numbers that I can find are that SOC analysts, about 1 out of 3 alerts that they look at is a false positive.
Oh, yeah.
And I knew that, but I didn't have the data to actually look at it. And I've seen some where it's higher, some where it's lower, but the middle of the ground is about 1 out of 3 alerts. And I also found that SOC analysts spend between 10 and 20 minutes looking into each and every alert. So we start off with this fundamentally flawed concept of IDS. Now, I still am a fan of IDS. I'm just saying its limitations. So for all the IDS vendors out there, I'm not trying to dig on your technology. I like it, but to be effective, we had to then add other technologies onto it, and a lot of administrative overhead and a lot of wasted time just dealing with all these false positives. So what I see is that a lot of organizations in practice don't utilize their IDS, IPS, SIM, well, maybe IPS, but they don't utilize their IDS or their SIM in real time. They're not monitoring their SIM. What they're doing is they're waiting for something bad to happen and then going back and using it as an investigative tool.
That's exactly right.
Which is fantastic. I mean, it works great, wonderful, great, rock on. Wouldn't it be nice is if we could come up with a high fidelity, low noise way of detecting bad guys? And that's the sweet spot of deception that I see today is this high fidelity, low noise. And I think I really like the approach you take is, all right, we're not baby stepping through this, right? High fidelity, low noise detection, we're jumping straight to the automated response, because if it is high fidelity and if it is low noise, why not automatically respond, which is really cool stuff.
Well, and especially, number one, you're right about the SOC analyst, right? I built an MSSP and was part of running 2 different ones. And it's really hard to make money as an MSSP because the SOC analysts spend a lot of time doing investigation. As you said, we give them more tools, more context, try to give them asset information so they know, what they're looking at, and it's still very difficult. But yeah, we jump right to that value point. It's interesting, especially using it on the perimeter, right, is where we see customers have a ton of value. I do a presentation where I talk about if 99% of your perimeter traffic was unwanted at best and potentially malicious, we have a word for that, right? We call that a DDoS, right? That's what that means.
Sure.
If 66% of your perimeter traffic is unwanted and potentially malicious, we call that Monday.
Yeah.
Right? It's every day. And so what we have seen is customers can use deception techniques, right, on the perimeter and reduce their unwanted and potentially malicious traffic by up to 70% from the perimeter, which does a lot of amazing things, right? All the things you talked about, it has a bunch of knock-on effects and acts, in my opinion, as a force multiplier. So your firewall's now not running at max utilization, right, using all the memory and disk. Your SIM is not filling up with alerts that are, kind of junky, not really of much value for anybody else to do anything with. And your SOC analyst now has a much smaller pile of needles to go through to find the needles that are, the ones they care about.
Yeah, and in all honesty, I think that can't be understated, because not only do we waste a lot of time and money having SOC analysts look at a bunch of false positives, but I've also seen reports that basically the churn of SOC analysts, the staff churn for SOC analysts is astronomical, right? Because they just get burnt out, because you're just like saying, sit in a really loud room and listen to obnoxious noise all day long.
Yeah, it's a tough job, man. It takes a certain kind of person. There's no doubt about it.
There's no question about it. Awesome. So in terms of an organization, so if I'm an organization and I am interested in deception, so what do you think are the biggest, so once people put deception in, right? Because obviously there's this aspect of you don't really know till you know. What do you think, what have you seen are the biggest surprises that organizations get once they deploy deception? Like, what's the thing where they're like, wow, I didn't realize that?
So, so I have to talk about it a little bit in the terms of our technology. So I apologize for that.
No, quite all right.
But because it exaggerates this to a great deal. So the visibility that it gives them, right? They get visibility into things happening that they weren't aware of, right? Because the way PacketViper works and it sits in line, we see all the traffic flowing through the network. And so the user can see what's happening, what countries traffic is coming from, what companies traffic is coming from, who's in their network. We've had a couple clients where we light up inside their network and, we find out that there's a bunch of OT traffic mixed in on the IT network that nobody really understood was there, right? So it's that transparency, that visibility of what's actually happening that I didn't see in any other mechanism, because I've got this ability to look for things and set up decoys that, you know, I can set my decoys to look at either be a very narrow target or be a very wide target. And I can use sensors on the network to be able to do broad examinations. So I can just get the visibility and I get to see things that I haven't seen before, which is, so if you think about it, traditional deception technologies, you set up these decoys and they're sort of pinpoints on the network. The way we approach it is we give you the visibility into the entire thing. And then that lets you start to now decide, how do you want to deploy your decoys? What's your deception strategy? What kind of deception campaigns are you going to start to do? And it enables threat hunting, right? So people talk about threat hunting. We feel like it's hard to do threat hunting if you don't have the visibility to see what's actually going on the network and be able to sort of start to classify things and examine them and be able to say, okay, I have traffic coming in from China. Is that directed at any certain set of assets, or is it directed at a certain set of services, right? What are they trying to do? Maybe I'll set up some decoys that are either in line with that or adjacent to that, so that I can, you know, have a better opportunity to be able to see. Or I see people coming in from one geographic location, attacking a certain thing, and then I see that that is now fanning out over the internet. So I see that one group started with this, and now there's other groups coming in after this. So that that transparency and visibility, I think, is really useful to be able to understand what's going on.
I mean, let's face it, there are organizations that pay fairly significant amounts of money to get that information via like threat intelligence services. And at best, those threat intelligence services are never going to be company specific or environment specific, right? They might be industry specific or whatever, but you're paying a lot of money for generic information. And it's valuable. It's important to understand something about our attackers. But if I can get that information that is relevant to my environment, that is an entirely different kind of game-changing thing. And I really like this aspect of, you know, when you talk about threat hunting, the way that I describe threat hunting, because one of the things that I do is I teach the SANS, hacker techniques, exploits, and incident handling class. So we're trying to teach some basics of incident handling in the context of what are the bad guys going to do. So we understand what the bad guys are going to do so we can do a more effective job of responding. And so after we go through that, when I talk about threat hunting, I basically say, like, close your eyes and imagine there's an incident. What are you going to do, right? You're going to capture network traffic. You're going to look at logs. You're going to, you know, maybe get some net flow data, whatever. You're going to investigate the incident. Well, in large part, threat hunting is just simply investigating the incident, even if you don't have any indication that an incident is happening.
That's right.
We're just proactively going to go investigate. And I'll be honest with you, I never really put deception in that context. It just never, the lines never connected. And when you were like that, I was like, well, wait a minute. Why wouldn't I use deception to do exactly that? Because it is, you know, it is by its very nature that almost proactive way of detecting bad guys on your network. So I really like that aspect of incorporating threat hunting into a deception plan. And the thing that I find so fascinating about deception is you do deception, you detect bad guys, you learn about the bad guys, which allows you to do better deception, which allows you to better detect the bad guys, which allows you to learn more about the bad guys. And it just cycles. And everything you do continues to reinforce the other things that you're doing, which is absolutely fantastic.
Oh, you know, you talked about how do people get started, right? And maybe barriers to getting started. And I think that's one of the things too. It's a sort of human nature to jump to sort of like this worst case scenario, like, oh, it's going to be so complicated, and I don't know if I know how to do it, and where am I going to put my decoys and all this other stuff. And you hit the nail on the head, and that's exactly what we try to support with our solution is this iterative approach, right? I don't need to boil the ocean on day one. I can start with a cup of water and go from there. And so we talk about, you know, the U.S. Department of Defense did some funding of research on something called moving target defense, MTD, right? And in their scenario, like the services are actually moving on the network, right? That's a bridge too far for almost any organization that we would talk to. But we can simulate that, right? I can set up deception groups that are specific to a source country, right? Because I'm on the perimeter, right? So if I want to look a certain way to China and a different way to Russia, I can do that. If I want to look a certain way during 8 to 5 p.m. and then a different way the rest of the day, I can do that, right? And so I can, you talked about, being harder to figure out, being more complicated than the other guy. I can start to build up these things that all of a sudden, a couple months or a year later, you're like, wow, you've really built up this set of decoys, set of sensors, to do your threat hunting, to get your, we have like a BI-like tool that lets you sort of slice and dice what you're seeing. And it doesn't have to start out being really sophisticated. You can start out with a handful of decoys and, iterate your way from there.
And two topics, one kind of somewhat related. You talk about that moving target defense. Another SANS instructor is a friend of mine, a guy named Randy Marcheni, runs some of the IT stuff for Virginia Tech University. Okay. And they've actually implemented something equivalent to frequency hopping spread spectrum across an IP version 6 range.
Nice.
So what they do is they literally have nodes that hop across IP version 6 addresses. So if you're watching it, like I forget if it's every few seconds or every minute or whatever, I'm on IP address, whatever. Next thing you know, I'm on IP address something else. Next thing you know, I'm on IP address something else, which I thought it's kind of interesting, that moving target defense, although not that related to some of the deception stuff. But to your point, and I think this is super, super important. You talked about it doesn't need to be some fantastically complex type of thing. The way that I like to put it is, today, bad deception works, right? Yeah. You could literally put a Netcat listener up on your laptop listening on port 80. And if you happen to catch the bad guy, you win. End of the story. Right. Bad deception works today because the attackers aren't looking for deception at all. Like, it's not what most attackers factor into what they're doing. Now, are the attackers ultimately going to become deception aware? Probably. If this thing kicks off and it succeeds to the level that I believe that it will, attackers are going to have to become more deception aware. But the cool thing is, in this arms race, we already know what our end game looks like. Right? Because, let's face it, we can get to the level of creating incredibly realistic deception, generating fake network traffic, generating fake social networking profiles, all reinforcing everything. We can create pristine deception. We just don't need to today. Right. And that's the thing that I like to tell people is, don't worry about it. IT people, we tend to, I think I've said it on this channel as well, but if you're an IT person, I honestly believe that we all have some minimal form of brain damage. And it's induced, right? Because I want you to think about this. If you are responsible for operating a network, and that network is up 95% of the time, do you have a job? You're fired, right? You have 5% downtime, you are done, right? So, IT people think in terms of whatever answer that I have has to solve 99.999% of the situations. Yeah. So when you present IT people with something, our immediate reaction is always to break it. Here's the situation why it won't work.
Right.
And that's a self-defense mechanism in IT, right? It's a good thing. But at the same point in time, in security, and this, I think this affects security people a lot, because security is never 5 nines, right? I'm gonna have 5 nines of security. I don't even know how I would measure that.
Right.
But it doesn't make any sense. So incremental gains are a beautiful thing. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to be better than the bad guys at detecting deception. And the bad guys are terrible at detecting deception. One of the ways that I look at it, so when my class is done, one of the things I'm going to do in the class is on day 1, I'm going to put out a big bowl of Jelly Belly jelly beans, right? The kinds that taste like buttered popcorn and cherries and mango. Yummy, right? So I'm going to put a big bowl of Jelly Belly jelly beans up in the front of the classroom on day 1. On day 2, I'm going to put that bowl back out there, but I'm going to add in the nasty flavors, right? Is it buttered popcorn or is it earwax, right? What's going to happen? And I'm going to tell the class that I've done it, right? I'm going to, guess what? Hey, jelly beans are here. There's nasty flavors in there. And it's basically going to be designed to be an object lesson. You know that there are deceptive jelly beans in this bucket. What are you going to do about it? Right? Are you going to not touch it because you don't want to accidentally eat earwax? Are you going to just say to heck with it and just grab a handful and gag throughout the rest of class, right? Are you going to come up with some analysis where you're going to shave off little pieces of, awareness of deception is going to change the attacker's behavior. It's going to make them have to slow down, rethink about how they go do things. So even when deception fails in the context of it has now been detected by the bad guy, we still win. The bad guy now has to change their tactics. And so you've got this easy to deploy, highly reliable, low noise, incredibly effective solution that even if the bad guy knows it's there, it still negatively impacts them. And I believe that all that stuff that I just said is the problem with deception. It's not a problem in an objective sense. It's a problem because it's almost like trying to get your boss to pay for the Sands class in Vegas because it's Vegas, right? So it appears that you're trying to just get a free trip to Vegas when actually you want to go to a really awesome Sands class.
Best class in the world, yeah.
Right. It's this aspect of it seems too good to be true. It really seems like there's so many benefits, and that's almost the big pushback. Hey, wait a minute. So I'm going to ask you a question that I have been asked many times.
Hey.
If this stuff is so good, why isn't everybody using it?
Oh my God, you're killing me. It's too simple. What you're saying is too simple. I've heard that 1,000 times. It can't be that easy, right? And the answer is yes, it is.
It is.
Like you said, bad deception is still, it's like pizza. It's still pretty good.
I've lived it because when I first got into deception, which was only a couple of years ago, I'm like going through this. So first of all, I'm going through it and I'm like, first of all, it took me a while to figure out what in the world, like wrap my head around it. I'm like, what is this? Right. This is weird. I don't understand. And then finally, like I was looking at all this deception stuff and I went, if I was trying to do a pen test against this environment, it would be terrible.
Right.
And that was like the click, like that was I get it. And I literally had to spend another 6 months going, what am I missing? I've got to be missing something. It can't be this good. And it is.
You're so spot on with that. I hear that a form of that all the time, right? Mm-hmm. A form of that. You know, something else that you touched on, is not to take us off track, but something else you touched on, but just to connect the dots, is things like Shodan, right? If you're using deception on the perimeter, you can poison Shodan, right? You can put bad information in there, right? You can put, you can use Shodan as a bait and lure to get people to go into your decoys, right?
I love it.
When you think about IPv6, right? You're not scanning the IPv6 address space looking for targets of opportunity, right?
No.
But you can use decoys to seed that they're out there. You can, once again, give people something to focus on that's not the stuff you don't want them to focus on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, think about, so if I want to scan an IPv6 network, right? Even an internal network, we could potentially be talking about more potential addresses than there are IP version 4 hosts on the planet. Right. So gigantic address space. So what I'm typically going to do is do something like an IP version 6 ping to the multicast address for the hosts or the routers. Well, why can't I redirect that ping? Right. All right. So you want to ping my IP version 6 multicast address? Great. Then I can use, how
many people should legitimately be doing that? Zero.
Right, none, right? It shouldn't be happening. So now I can just simply respond to that ping with fake information. I mean, it's that kind of stuff that I just find so absolutely fascinating about this stuff. Let me ask you this. I ask this quite often. It's kind of my survey, right? Have you ever met anybody that truly understands cyber deception that is not incredibly passionate about it?
No.
No. I mean, this stuff, I've told people, and I say it, and I will say it again and again. I believe that when we get to the point where deception becomes the norm and is done well, it will be easier to break into a place physically to exfiltrate data than it will be to get it across the network.
What a beautiful thing that would be, huh?
How amazing.
Make crime local again.
Yeah, I mean, how awesome. Like, that sounds like a great marketing slogan, right? You need to go talk to your marketing department and be like, PacketViper, make crime local again. It is a beautiful thing. So this has been awesome. I try to keep these things to about an hour, and that's kind of where we are right now. I'm going to throw it out to you for any last minute anything, right? What do you want to throw in there? It could be just a pitch for your product or a concept. What do you want to finish with?
You know, obviously we have a great product and you should all go out and buy it. But I think that the biggest thing, you know, sort of what you hit on earlier, if you've thought about deception, if somebody's talked to you about it and you've had that thought, right, it can't be that simple, or what's the catch, right? I would tell you, please suspend disbelief for just a little bit. Do a proof of concept, do a trial, try it out. Just try it out and see if it isn't all it's cracked up to be, then, you know, you move on and do something else. But I would give it a shot, right? Just give it a shot.
Yeah, and the other thing that I will throw out there, and I am in no way affiliated with any deception vendor, and in fact, I haven't even talked to most of them, but I will say this. The times that I've seen pricing on deception technology, it has actually been far less expensive than I thought it was going to be. I'm not saying it's pocket change, right? I mean, it's scale and all that kind of stuff, but we're talking about, you know, compared to the deployment of an IDS or a SIM or some of those types of things, it tends to be really cost effective, easy to deploy, highly effective, and you don't need to be perfect at it. So just go do it, because let's face it, that's the only way that we win, right? It really is.
Yep.
So awesome. Well, this has been fantastic, and thank you so much. So for those of you who are watching, please definitely hit that little subscribe button, little notification. You guys know the deal. And seriously, if you're still, you know, if you're watching this and you would like to see any content on this channel, please, you know, hit me up in the comments and all that kind of stuff. Because let's face it, we've got to start getting together, exchanging information about this cyber deception stuff, because in truth, that is the way that we take back the advantage.